There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the U.S. for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine-Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. Oh goodness, pop music, you are so very problematic. And now, thanks to Trolls World Tour, now even the children be knowing. Even the children be knowing. Okay. Before we talk about pop music, let me give you a brief overview of this categorical dragging of pop music and perhaps other things disguised as an animated movie targeted towards children. Trolls World Tour is a sequel to the 2016 animated film Trolls. In the sequel, Poppy, the main character, lives in a world where she believes she and the other troll citizens that she's in charge of, she's the queen, are the center of the troll universe. As a matter of fact, she actually doesn't even know there are other trolls that exist until her father, the immediate past king of the trolls, begrudgingly shares a map that still centers Poppy and what we find out are the other pop trolls like her, but it also shows there are other trolls minding their troll business, living their non-pop singing lives. Her father then gives her a false narrative as to why everyone lives separate, conveniently leaving out that the pop trolls, stole from everyone. Poppy decides to go to the other worlds, or I guess geographical regions, and attempts to foster her style of music on the other genre of trolls because, as she says, we're all trolls and we should all sound like this and sing happy music all the time. And my version of happy music is happy music, and my way is the best way. And then the funk trolls, who are clearly black, had to lovingly let her know, no, baby, we're not all the same. That's okay. And BTW, your ancestors, the pop troll, stole from everyone. So I was watching the movie with my children like, okay, is this just me, or are they really getting into something deeper than appropriation here? Let's talk about it. I'm really excited to explore the deeper meaning of what Trolls World Tour tried to scratch the surface of with Dr. Jack Hamilton. Jack is a cultural historian who studies sound, media, and popular culture, and is an associate professor of media studies and American studies at UVA. He is a pop critic for Slate Magazine, where he writes about music, sports, and other areas of culture. His first book, Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination, focused on the transatlantic interplay of popular music and racial thought during the 1960s, and explores how rock and roll moved from being an interracial type of music to being widely understood as a white one by the end of the decade. Dr. Hamilton is currently working on a book about music and technology since the 1960s. Hi, Jack. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Woo! So, Jack, let's establish a baseline. Historically, why is pop music such a contentious genre?
Yeah, that's a great question. Largely because I think the sort of history of American music is basically Black American music. And so American pop music is disproportionately influenced by the music of Black Americans. And that is the outsized influence in American popular music. And as anyone knows, African American musicians have not historically been adequately compensated or recognized for the contributions that they've made to this history, particularly in an economic sense. A lot of what it boils down to is that this is an area of American culture in which Black artists have had an absolutely outsized influence. Another area you could probably make this argument about too would be sports. But yeah, music is probably, in terms of going all the way back to basically the beginning of American culture, whatever you want to say that starts, like this is the story of it. And so it's definitely something that pop music is a place where these issues of quote unquote appropriation and sort of racial exploitation and just sort of economic exploitation, economic injustice, you can go all down the line. They've been really prominent. You know, the kind of concept of pop music really emerges with the recording industry. The history of the recording industry in the United States, which starts really at the beginning of the 20th century, like these issues are just incredibly prominent from the very beginning. And so you could certainly argue that it is the central issue in the history of particularly American popular music.
And I definitely want to get into the recording piece and some of these other pieces that you touched on. So according to an article by the History Channel named How Race Records Turned Black Music into Big Business, the writer Aaron Blakemore says America had segregated schools, buses, and Black people had to watch movies and theatrical performances from hot, dirty balconies and were excluded from much of white culture, especially in the Jim Crow South. And even popular culture was segregated. Race, media, music, films, and publications were created by and for African Americans and white audiences who seldom knew or cared about these creative art forms. White record labels, which had been losing market share with the introduction of radio, could easily exploit and underpay Black artists more than white ones. Many of their songs had never been published, and labels snagged recording rights along with the recordings. And many artists were put on records that gave them pseudonyms or left out their names entirely. I don't know if Aaron is a man or a woman, but Aaron goes on to say that countless others were recorded without contracts and without being paid royalties, since Black artists were mostly excluded from the American Society of Composers, Artists, and Performers, and the few that did have royalty agreements didn't have much chance of enforcing them. Eventually, white audiences caught on to Black music, and the writer goes on to say, and I'm sure you would probably agree with this, that race records were rebranded as rhythm and blues, aka R&B. So how do pop music's roots intersect with race records?
Very directly. So pop music is a really weird and broad concept. If you ask someone to define what pop music is, you're going to get a different answer from everyone because no one totally knows what it means. Basically, what it means is a commercial designation. In the words of Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown Records, pop means popular. Who doesn't want music to be popular? Two things that happen in the 1920s is that, as you mentioned, the sort of race records category is established. And in 1920, Mamie Smith records Crazy Blues, and it sells over 100,000 copies. And this is the recording that makes the record industry aware of like, oh my God, there's this massive market for Black recorded music. And that's really early. 1920 is when the record industry is like basically pretty new. And then similarly in the 1920s, you also get the rise of white Southern music, which was billed as hillbilly music. And a lot of people have argued that that tradition of what comes to be known as country music and then what comes to be known as blues or R&B are really kind of the same music when you get to the bottom of them. It's just that they were segregated out by the industry to create these sort of markets. There's a great book about this actually called Segregating Sound. It's written by a colleague of mine at UVA named Carl Hagster Miller. But so what happens is, particularly by the 20s and 30s, a lot of what's showing up in the pop charts is actually music. I mean, this is particularly true with Black music, race records and stuff. The big commercially popular music of the 20s and particularly the 30s is really jazz and like swing jazz. A lot of times jazz was being performed by white artists. So, Benny Goodman or like Paul Whiteman or something. But you also had people like Duke Ellington. Louis Armstrong was a massively successful performer in the 20s and 30s. Cab Calloway, Count Basie. That was pop music. It's weird for us now, I think, to think of jazz as being pop music, but it was for quite a long time. And sometimes country music became pop music too. Like Hank Williams had a lot of his songs like made the pop chart, even if it wasn't him performing them. So it's the pop charts are taking all of this stuff from other places and figuring out ways to sell it to the most amount of people. But pop music itself, I think what we could both agree that country music, for instance, or R&B music is rooted in a real historical tradition, whereas it's like pop music, it's always been something that's just feeding off anything that it can. You turn on like top 40 radio and any given moment, you're going to hear stuff that sounds really different. Whereas if you turn on a country radio station, even today, or you turn on an R&B radio station, the term they use is urban for that format, you're going to hear music that sounds probably fairly similar to each other on those types of radio formats. Or, a more recent one would be like rock radio or something like that. Whereas you turn on a top 40 station, you're going to hear all sorts of stuff because there's not really like a musical definition of what it is outside of whatever's selling the most at a given time. Sorry, that was probably a long-winded example, but
no, that makes sense. And it's so funny that you bring up urban because I want to talk about that. When I was looking at when people consider the origination of pop, they say like the 1950s. Is that, would you agree?
Yeah, I would say for our modern conception of pop, that's probably true. Especially thinking about pop as a music that's fundamentally associated with young people, then I think the 50s is where you start to see that. Like the way we think of pop music today originates then. Yeah.
Okay, so then in the 1950s, white performers started covering, meaning that they were singing the same songs that Black artists would make. And then they were introduced as pop and they were singing the exact same song. And then they would make more money, even if, sometimes the Black people were paid very little. It was interesting to know that 1950s is considered the time that pop music was considered to have its birth. But that's like also when you start seeing cover records. So I think that's really an interesting and maybe even convenient time.
Yeah, totally. So like the kind of quintessential example of what you're describing is a guy named Pat Boone, who is a white Canadian singer. And in the 50s, he was notorious for basically, he'd covered Little Richard, he covered Fats Domino. And, this was at a period too when both of those artists, Little Richard and Fats Domino, had big pop hits. And they made some money because they had the songwriting and stuff like that. But you had a lot of radio stations that were like, oh, suddenly we have Little Richard doing Tutti Frutti, which Little Richard wrote. And we have Pat Boone doing this really terrible version of Tutti Frutti. But he's got this kind of like white, like he looked like a TV star kind of thing. So they're like, why don't we just play this guy instead? So Little Richard starts seeing his sales drop because he's not getting promoted on radio. It was a real issue in the 50s, certainly. And some of that too had to do with the fact that a lot of the people marketing rock and roll music didn't totally understand what it was. It wasn't taken seriously. It was seen as a fad. So it was like, what's the difference between Little Richard and Pat Boone? If you're like a 50-year-old white radio programmer, it probably all sounds the same to you in the 1950s. Yeah, but that definitely happened. The cover song phenomenon of the 50s.
So you brought up urban. Warner Music Group plans to stop using the term urban to refer to music by Black artists. I don't know if you heard about that. I'm sure you... Yeah,
some places are getting rid of it.
So, and iHeartRadio, the largest radio company in the United States, plans to phase out urban. They are just going to use hip hop and R&B instead. Mm-hmm. But even with that, there's a 2020 article published by the Rolling Stone entitled Separate and Unequal, How Pop Music Holds Black Artists Back. The writer Elias Late says, to get rid of the urban category while not wiping out pop simultaneously amounts to a new frosting on the same old cake, preserving a system in which Adele and Jazmine Sullivan could sing the same exact song with identical power and grace, but Adele's version will go straight into every supermarket across the country, while Sullivan's will be pushed only to Black listeners in select cities. In your opinion, is R&B essentially the Jim Crow section?
Yeah, in certain instances, I think you could argue that. Like that one, that's a great example. Adele is a soul singer. She's an R&B singer.
Exactly.
That's
exactly what she is.
Yeah. And so it's like, why does she get this different category than like even an equivalently huge star like Beyonce doesn't get that sort of like weird pop thing that Adele gets, I would argue, and certainly not someone like Jazmine Sullivan. So it's interesting because it's like the question of R&B and its segregation, it's historically been pretty complicated because there was also a period too where the R&B industry really saw itself as something else, and they saw their audience as something like, oh, we're serving this particular audience that is not interested in what's on pop radio. A classic example, this was certainly true in like this sort of late 70s and early 80s, where you had people like Teddy Pendergrass, for instance, or even Luther Vandross, who were massively successful R&B stars and didn't really see a lot of pop crossover. But they and their fans, by their own telling, were fine with that because they were like, that's not what we do. You turn on pop radio in the early 80s and you're going to hear Christopher Cross and stuff. And like, that was not what Teddy Pendergrass...
So like, yes, we would call Teddy Pendergrass and Luther Vandross Black famous.
Mm-hmm. Totally, exactly. And then you see that kind of change in the mid 80s. The big shift is Michael Jackson comes on and like Thriller. I think people have forgotten, but like someone like Whitney Houston was actually fairly controversial in the mid to late 80s.
That's a great example.
Because she was a huge pop star who certain R&B audiences didn't really like, because they were like, you didn't, you're not on our radio. You're going straight to.
Didn't know that.
Like, yeah, there's like a famous instance of she got booed at I think it was the Soul Train Awards in like 1989. She won Best Female Vocalist, and the crowd booed her. They thought it was basically bogus that this pop singer, even though she was Black and obviously was an incredible singer, the fact that she had beaten artists who they saw as more sort of like in line with R&B.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated question. But generally speaking, I would say most musicians want that pop success. They want those sales. These situations in which R&B is getting kept off pop radio and there's not those opportunities for artists to cross over into that mainstream, like most artists will tell you, that's bad. Artists want to make money. They want to have their music reach as many people as possible. And so certainly, yeah, if you were to get rid of this sort of urban category, or if you were to make one big chart, it sounds good in theory, but the way that the industry has historically worked, it's going to probably end up just being like white artists get favored for various reasons. It's racism, but it's like you just see that pattern happen again and again and again.
More Impolite Conversation in just a moment. The new HBO documentary Yusuf Hawkins' Storm Over Brooklyn tells the story of Yusuf Hawkins, a Black teenager who was murdered in 1989 by a group of young white men in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. His death and the official response to it sparked outrage in New York. The film, directed by Muta Ali Muhammad, explores the 30-year legacy of Yusuf's murder, and his family and friends reflect on the tragedy and the subsequent fight for justice that inspired and divided New York City. Stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. There's the other example, Megan Thee Stallion.
Mm-hmm.
Megan Thee Stallion invented the Hot Girl Summer meme. And she released a single that was an urban radio success. And then a white singer, Black Bear, created his own concept called Hot Girl Bummer. Did you hear about this?
No, I didn't hear about this.
Oh, it was played heavily on pop radio.
I knew about Hot Girl Summer, but I didn't know the Black Bear thing.
I didn't know about that either. But apparently it was played very heavily on pop radio. And then since that format reaches more listeners, Hot Girl Bummer has nearly 160 million more streams than Hot Girl Summer.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah, totally. That is, yeah. I mean, like,
I had never even heard of Hot Girl Bummer. I'm like, oh, maybe, I don't know. I thought maybe you had heard of it.
No, I hadn't heard of it.
But just because of the simple categorization of it being pop and then it reaching more audiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like,
this is what you're talking about.
So for when I was growing up, the music that I was most interested in, that I was the biggest fan of when I was a kid and was listening to the radio a lot, was hip hop. I listened to hip hop radio all the time, and that was certainly like its own form. Like in New York, it was like Hot 97.
Hey, did you grow up in New York?
No, I grew up in Boston, actually, but I went to college in New York.
I'm 42. How old are you?
41.
So you were essentially raised during like the golden age of hip hop.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. Yeah. I was
but
just
it was
trying to
Well, what was interesting, I'm sure you remember from that era, was it was pretty hard for rappers to get on top 40 radio. The rappers who were on top 40 radio in the late 80s and early 90s were like Hammer, Vanilla Ice. And if you knew hip hop, you were like, where is the good stuff? And it finally starts to get on it. Like certainly someone like Biggie had pop hits, and Dr. Dre and The Chronic and stuff, that definitely hit onto top 40. But it was a while before, like, and certainly in the 80s, hip hop really wasn't on top 40 radio very much. And then there was this sort of weird, you'd have hip hop artists who do collaborations with R&B artists or pop artists. That was a way that you could get on the radio. A lot of R&B stations didn't even play hip hop, because their listeners were like, I don't want to hear that.
Like WBLS.
Right, totally. And so that's always been a strange thing. And I think today, I don't listen to radio very much anymore.
Yeah, I don't. You
so
listen to satellite, right? Or like streaming services. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's weird. A couple of years ago, I was in LA. I was with a friend. And we rented a car and we were like driving around a lot. And we were listening to whatever the big LA hip hop station is. And it was interesting because the stuff that they were playing, because it's sort of a hip hop station, but it's also kind of top 40-ish. They were playing a lot of Rihanna and hip hop influenced pop music. Drake was on all the time, but like also Post Malone was on all the time, who's certainly someone there's a lot to be said about Post Malone and the fact that he gets on radio formats that a lot of other hip hop artists won't get on, and it's because he's white. And I think there's a lot of white people who listen to Post Malone's music that don't listen to other hip hop. That's weird. You know, it was like that with Eminem too. And it was like that with the Beastie Boys before. You know, that's always been this sort of weird phenomenon, I think.
And to your point about the segregation of radio, when I was a teenager, like I said, you're 41 and first, so we're contemporaries. I grew up in Westchester, like I grew up basically in New York City suburb. I would listen to Hot 97 for my rap. And when I wanted to listen to other stuff, I would listen to Z100. To your point, when you were saying like R&B, like the R&B station was WBLS. So I started this episode talking about trolls because I felt what they were talking about was more than just appropriation. And I even think appropriation, it tends to get reduced to can white people do non-white things, which I'm actually a little tired of that word because it's like reductive the way that people talk about it. The lead troll, Poppy, she's raised to believe she's literally the only type of troll, which I think is actually very significant and intentional. Like, the world is centered around me. We're the only types of trolls that exist, right? And her father actually went to great lengths to hide other trolls from her until the hard rock trolls forced his hand. And to me, what they were actually talking about, the way that I interpreted it, was about erasure. We're not even going to acknowledge your existence. And what I found to be even more interesting was the fact that it was the funk trolls who delivered the message. There were these trolls who are obviously supposed to be black, even though they're all trolls. It's like, these people are obviously black. And they're like, hey, your ancestors are problematic. There are many that would argue in the way that R&B is racialized, that term pop is racialized. So the question that the Rolling Stones writer, the writer from the article that I brought up, he's actually exploring, okay, we're getting rid of urban. Should we get rid of pop too? What are your thoughts on this?
It's hard because these things exist in so many different kind of ways. So there's the Billboard charts, and like those have changed so much. The two basic commercial modes of musical genre making are charts, which is published in Billboard, which is like the industry magazine, and then radio, format radio. So it's the idea that there's country stations and there's R&B stations, and then there's top 40, and top 40 is like what pop is for radio. First of all, no one buys music anymore. Like, I was just reading a book about music in the year 1984. It was really great. It's coming out. It's called Can't Slow Down. Just a little plug there. 84 is the year that Thriller went into the Guinness Book of World Records as the highest selling album ever. And I was just like, God, like Thriller sold so many copies. It is going to hold that record forever because Thriller sold like
my 8-year-old knows what Thriller is.
Yeah, by some estimates, it's sold over 100 million copies. And I don't even know that an album is ever going to sell 10 million copies again. It's just because of the way that we listen to music. And then, and then radio, like we were saying, I don't listen to the radio, like terrestrial radio, commercial radio very much anymore. Stuff like Spotify or Apple Music or whatever are able to give people like a much more curated, personalized experience. Yeah. And certainly there's genre playlists. I know that Spotify's like Rap Caviar playlist is like really important to up and coming rappers. If you get something on that, it's huge. But I don't think it's the same as radio programmers deciding, really being able to be like, okay, we're going to make this song a hit. Thinking about pop as like an industry shorthand, as something that governs the way music is sold. And that I think you could see change a lot. I think we've already seen it change a lot because of the fact that like music isn't selling in the same ways that it did. And just no one's quite sure how to market music anymore. Like, it used to be that it was just like music was about going to a record store and buying it or getting it on the radio, or then slightly later getting it on MTV. But then the idea of pop, that it's if you hear something and you're like, that's pop, listeners, I think, are always going to think in terms of genres because it's like they're connected to them. Like, hip hop fans are super invested in being like, this is hip hop, this isn't hip hop. You know, like,
yeah,
it's like
policing. There's definitely a policing of hip hop.
Exactly. And there is with rock too. There certainly is with country too, because listeners become invested in them. And sometimes artists become invested in them as well. Pop doesn't really have that so much. I don't think there's that many pop fans that are like snobbish about what they consider to be. It's just kind of different because it's so purely linked to commercialism. I think the concept of pop as it's historically functioned as like an industry thing, you could see that start to go away. I would argue that it already has started to go away, at least in the way that
I wonder if they're two sides of the same coin, R&B and pop. Are they just racialized terms, coded language, right? Like these race neutral terms that are actually supposed to be identifying race.
Yeah,
you know what
totally.
I mean? So I wonder what progress looks like as it relates to that.
Something else that's become much more of a prominent thing in recent years is Latin musical influences, which like didn't used to be all that prominent in American pop. And like now they're all over the place. You know, on the radio, American music has always tended to think of itself as this binary. It's like there's black music and white music. You're now seeing other categories that are coming in and like, it's like, wait, what do we exactly? Yeah. And so like that too is frazzling out where pop is. In the book that I wrote about that was about the 60s, where in the 60s was definitely a time when everyone took for granted that it was like a black-white divide. But kind of at the end of the 60s, Carlos Santana like hits the scene and he's a first major Chicano rock star. One of the things that was so funny was like reading old music criticism from that period, and no one knew how to talk about him because he fell outside of these like stereotypes that people had created. I think the sort of white-black dichotomy will definitely continue to probably dominate the way a lot of music is thought about for a long time and marketed, frankly.
But what does progress look like for you? For example, the Eminems and the Post Malones and those people, Jazmine Sullivan and Adele. What categories should they be in? Where would you like to see these people? Well, Post Malone and Eminem are in their correct category. So I think Jazmine Sullivan and Adele would be a better example. Like, where would you like to see both of them?
I would like to see Jazmine Sullivan have the same success that Adele has. And I think you're right that I find a lot of the sort of like conversations about sort of appropriation to be like at a certain point, it's like hits a wall because they're so complicated and there's so much stuff going on. I do think that there has been in recent years more of an attempt, particularly among artists, to acknowledge influences and like try to shine spotlight. And certainly throughout history, there have been some people that have been better about doing that than others. Someone like Eminem, who obviously has a lot of issues. And there's a lot of problematic things about Eminem's music. But something Eminem has always been, I think people respect about him in hip hop is that he's been very open about acknowledging his influences, about like bringing with him black rappers who he grew up around in Detroit and giving them huge label deals and using his fame to boost up other people. You know, whatever people think about Elvis, like Elvis didn't really do that. And Eminem is kind of an Elvis figure, I think. That's one of the reasons why Eminem has a lot of respect in the sort of hip hop community, in part because he did that. And I don't know that Post Malone has really done the same thing. But yeah, someone like Adele, I think, has at times tried to speak openly about her own sort of like privilege within the industry. It's been interesting seeing white artists talk about that more openly, in part because of the fact that I think people have become more aware of it in recent years.
To your point about that, the commentary that they're making in the movie to me is very clear. I think for anybody who has a basic knowledge, like you bring up Elvis, you bring up Post Malone, you also bring up Eminem and the different ways that they acknowledge or don't acknowledge the roots. Do you think that pop has an issue with this? Acknowledging its black roots. Some of these newer artists who are acknowledging, are they the outlier? Or is it just sort of we're seeing a trend now of them sort of acknowledging like, hey, this is where I'm taking my roots from?
You don't want to be like too like, yay, progress. But I do think that there has been a certain degree of progress in terms of we're not in a situation in 2020 like it was in the 50s where it was like black artists just wouldn't get on pop radio, particularly in certain parts of the country. You turn on a top 40 radio station, you're definitely going to hear artists of color frequently. I think the real issue is that like because of pop, because it's such an industry thing, it's so openly commercial, it's not itself interested in history because history doesn't sell. So I think that there's always that problem. The pop industry is not going to correct its history unless people force it to, because there's not money in honoring old and righting historical wrongs. And like what it mostly is about is selling product to people. To go back to these sort of other genres, like a genre like R&B or a genre like country or something, which have like real strong senses of history. And that's because like you have audiences that are invested in them.
is
Whereas
the
it's
history of pop cover records. Do you know what I mean?
You could,
like,
yeah.
Like, as I was researching for this episode, and I was like, okay, it started in the 1950s, and this is where I'm like, wait, is this the history of pop music, like stealing from other people?
It's weird because it's like these days, I feel like you don't see the phenomenon of cover music very much at all anymore. Part of that's because you think about hip hop as like probably the dominant genre of popular music. Hip hop doesn't do covers hardly ever. Like it's hard to think of. One thing that has been confusing is that like really up until the 50s and 60s, it was not common for singers to write their own material, like in any genre. There were professional songwriters that did that and they gave music to singers. That starts to change. And you had artists that were writing their own music. And now we've gone back to certainly some artists write their own music, but there's definitely like now much more people who are behind the scenes who are writing stuff. Can you get this song to this artist kind of thing? And so that's going back to the older model. You see that happen a lot in pop. Like Max Martin, like the Swedish dude, he's like all over pop radio and he's written for everyone. And there's just a number of people like that who's like aren't people who are super well known. But like if you look at a Beyonce album or you look at a Katy Perry album or whatever, you'll see those names like over and over. That itself, and that's kind of a pop thing too. So it's
not
weird.
Write your
like,
own music.
Yeah, like these really, really famous songs, like particularly in recent years, that have been like huge hits, and then you'll hear that some other artists like turned it down. Umbrella, like the Rihanna song that's huge, that was written by like The Dream and Tricky Stewart. A whole bunch of famous artists passed on that song. Like that was like floating around. And people were like, nah, I don't want that, which of course now seems crazy.
Right.
That happens pretty often. So that raises itself like weird questions. Yeah, that's not quite a cover record situation, but it kind of is. The artist The Dream, he wrote Umbrella for Rihanna. He wrote Single Ladies for Beyonce. He's just written tons. But his own music, which is really great, has never been able to cross over into the levels that he has seen it when other people do his stuff, which is probably frustrating for him.
I don't understand how the industry works. Who decides who's going to be pop and who's going to be R&B?
That's the thing. It's really hard, like particularly these days. So it used to be when the music industry had a lot more power in how they marketed artists and what artist records they pushed to what formats. A real famous instance of this would be Prince, who when Prince signed to Warner Brothers when he was like 17 years old, one of the things he said was he was like, I don't want my music confined to your R&B division. If I sign with Warner Brothers, I want you to put all of your effort into getting my music onto pop. And it took a while for him to get it, but Warner agreed to that. They were like, we're not just going to give your music to our R&B division, because that was during that period that I was talking about when there really wasn't very much R&B crossover to the pop charts. And he wasn't interested in being Teddy Pendergrass. He was interested in being, the biggest star in the universe. But like these days, like a label like Warner, which still very much exists, they don't have that kind of power anymore, like really, because what that is ultimately about is what record stores your product gets put into.
Right.
And what radio stations it gets pushed to. A great example I think of with this is now like the number one chart topping pop single ever is Old Town Road by Lil Nas X, who is someone who like didn't have a label when he like made that, like he came out of nowhere. He like made this song at home.
And then got pushed out of the country. Yeah, that was a whole kerfuffle, right? Yeah,
so there was this weird thing that happened with that, but then it was also like he had the biggest song in the country for 20 weeks straight or something, like literally a record. And he did that basically himself, because in this era, you don't need a record label anymore.
But even him, he had to fight to get in the country genre, right? Or something like that.
Country is still a genre where radio is huge. Country listeners still listen to country radio way more than other audience groups listen to traditional format radio. So if a country radio station decides that they don't want to play Old Town Road because like their audience doesn't want to hear it for whatever reason, or they think their audience doesn't want to hear it, then that's an instance where you can see radio have a real effect in terms of what's that chart, the country chart. That's my understanding of it, at least, was like largely due to the power that country radio holds. And that's certainly
and
like,
it was also racialized too.
Totally, absolutely. Yeah. Country radio programmers thought that their audience would be mad hearing this like young black kid with a hip hop beat, even though there's a lot of hip hop influence in country these days. The Lil Nas X phenomenon was like, because he was an artist where it's like 20 or 30 years earlier, he probably
nobody would know.
Totally. So yeah, it's this question of how any of this is working anymore in terms of basically no one knows how to sell music anymore. So it's an interesting time. And in some ways that's been really liberating for some artists, but it's a bad time to be a musician in any capacity because stuff like Spotify, even if you have a big hit on Spotify, like you're probably not making that much money from it.
So thank you so much for joining us. This was such an interesting conversation. Please tell us the name again of your book.
Just Around Midnight, Rock and Roll and the Racial Imagination. It's available like Amazon, anywhere you buy books.
So this is my last question that we ask all of our guests. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh, man. My favorite restaurant ever was a combination of like sentimental and also just the food was awesome. So there used to be a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the East Coast Grill. It's not there anymore. It closed down a few years ago, but it was part seafood. They had some barbecue stuff, but it was like they made really spicy food. That was like what they were known for. They used to have this event called Hell Night where there was just like everything on the menu was made with like crazy peppers and stuff. And I just loved that place. It was like so great. And I'm always bummed that it's not there anymore. So I think my ideal would be to resurrect that restaurant and like eat there.
Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.